and when Jameson takes some breaks throughout his presentation, I'll take a look at the chats and see if anyone has any questions. And just want to introduce Jameson Courtney. He's an Austin native and a graduate of University of Texas. He's worked at Floodplain as a floodplain manager with the city for 12 years. And before that, he was a contractor for FEMA working on floodplain mapping and disaster recovery. And he served on the board of Texas Floodplain Management Association, and he currently serves on their government relations committee. And just really appreciate him doing this class for us today. We all know in Texas that flooding is a big issue, and it's important for you to know when you're helping your clients buy and sell what the regulations are for the city and where you can direct them to information. So Jameson, I'll let you take over, and you can go ahead and
get
your slides whenever.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. So let's see. Let me share my screen here. So yeah, I thought this is going to be just kind of a guideline of what I feel realtors need to understand about floodplains in the city, so that y'all can better inform your clients. It always makes my job easier if home buyers know everything they need to know going into a situation, rather than us having to have some difficult conversations later down the line as they're learning something for the first time. So I'm happy to be here and share with y'all. There's kind of 3 sections to this, and so if y'all want to put questions in the chat when we get to the end of each section, I thought I'd take we can check the chat and talk about stuff from that. And then at the end, when I'm done, I've got plenty of time today, so we can then have some lengthier discussions, or I can walk through using some of our web resources and look some stuff up and talk through together if you have specific properties that y'all are listing or buyers are looking at that y'all have questions about. So with that, there's going to be a few parts to this. We're going to talk about just kind of what floodplains are and understanding flood risk. And then I thought we could talk about some just kind of my summary of considerations for home buyers. And then we can get into the actual development regulations. I think that's a real important thing for people to understand, especially in Austin currently, where everybody seems to be buying properties with the ideas of redeveloping them or making improvements to them. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what flood risk is and floodplains are. So floodplains are natural features of the landscape. It's the low-lying area around a waterway, a creek or a river, that gets inundated with water when we have more flow than the channel can hold. So it's really part of the creek, if you want to think about it that way. When we get these heavy rains in Austin, that rainfall generates runoff that goes to the creek. And if we get enough rain, within a certain duration of time, that can generate more water in the creek than the creek can hold, and that'll spill out into the floodplain. And so they're dominant. It's predominantly a natural feature of the landscape, and they provide a lot of benefits to the landscape. It's good for the ecological health of our city to have floodplains work and function the way they naturally want to. And human activity can affect floodplains. Certainly, we do engineering projects to try and control flood risk. Development can have some impact, but it's really, the point I want to make is flooding's a natural occurrence. Floodplains are natural things, and really, human activity has less impact than I think a lot of people assume. Certainly, improper development can cause lots of flood risk, but it's not going to have a big impact on our floodplains. This photo here is from the 1930s. It's around Lamar and 12th Street on Shoal Creek. And this house definitely was not originally in this spot. You can see it's been washed downstream and is kind of pinned against these trees, and the front porch is starting to buckle. And so if we go to this slide, we can kind of talk more about them being natural features. This is an artist rendering of Austin from long in the past, and we can see the Shoal Creek floodplain. The arrow is actually pointing to where that last photo was, where the house was roughly. But we can see the Shoal Creek itself, the channel, and then around it, over time, over lots of floods, it's eroded this floodplain that is very clearly defined in the past, and even today, we can still see where the floodplain is. You can still see that, and we've got lots of buildings in it. But you saw in that flood of that old photo, it's floods have been happening for a long time. Really the issue is that we have development in the floodplains, and that's what we have to try and figure out how to best manage and how to build for, so that the floods that do naturally occur don't cause big losses and disruptions for the city. There's a couple geographic factors that really go into what makes flooding in Austin so unique. If you're from another part of the country or the state, maybe the type of flooding we have here isn't as familiar to you, but it's definitely flash flooding. It happens very quickly, and we get very little warning time. And that's really the main reason why we take development regulations so seriously, is that in a lot of Austin's watersheds, we don't have sufficient warning time to evacuate people. We can start getting rain on Shoal Creek, and 15 minutes later we have flooding occurring. And so that's why our building codes are as strict as they are, is because this isn't like the Mississippi River where we know days or a week out that the flood's going to happen, or the coast where the hurricane's coming and you do have some time to evacuate. And so some of the contributing factors to that, we have large-scale weather patterns like El Nino. We have tropical systems from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. And then the start of the hill country. This is kind of Austin, the hill country is the first big increase in elevation from the Gulf. And so that naturally kind of stalls out air masses. And so this is where cold fronts and warm air from the Gulf naturally collide here. And that's what gives us some of the real intense rainfall that we can experience. And then on top of that, we have, those hills give you steep slopes, and so runoff moves faster, gets to the creeks faster. We tend to have kind of thin topsoil in the west. It doesn't absorb that much rain, so we get a lot of that rain that does fall as runoff. Or in the east, we've got some kind of unique clay soils that keep them from absorbing water quickly. So all those factors combined, and we can have very dramatic and quickly occurring floods. And so then, when we talk about floods from a regulatory sense, we talk about the 100-year floodplain. That's a term I'm sure all of y'all have heard, the 100-year flood. Another way to put that is that it's a flood that has a 1% chance of occurring every year. FEMA's tried to kind of transition to wanting us to call it the 1% annual chance flood. I think that's a bit of a mouthful, but I do think it's important to talk about that a 100-year floodplain is not a flood that occurs every 100 years. It's a flood that has a 1% chance of occurring every year. So statistically, we should be having one roughly every 100 years, but that's statistics. That's not the way nature really works. Another way to think about it is that if there's a 1% chance every year, over 30 years, there's a 26% chance. So I think this is a really valuable tool for realtors to understand. A lot of people are, you're taking out a 30-year mortgage on your home. Well, if it's in the 100-year floodplain, that means that there's essentially a 1 in 4 chance of that flood occurring during the time that you're paying your mortgage. And so, that starts putting it more into perspective of why we regulate this, why maps, why insurance may be required, because a 26% chance, that's a lot higher probability than, say, you having a house fire. Nobody really questions that you want to have homeowners insurance to protect against a house fire, but if you're in the 100-year floodplain, that flood is more likely to occur than the fire. And so, that's why we have these regulations and flood insurance and all of that. That can occur multiple times in a year or quickly together. Some of those factors we talked about that can cause our flooding can kind of make floods sort of group together. If we have an El Nino year, if we have a strong hurricane season, it's possible that we could have a decade of drought with no flooding and then have a couple years where it seems to be flooding constantly. 2013, 2015 were both bad flood years for the city, very close together. And luckily, we've been in a pretty dry cycle ever since. And then the 100-year flood is the FEMA nationwide standard for regulating flood risk. It's what most communities use for their regulations. It's what lenders use for flood insurance, and et cetera. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what floodplain maps don't show. So, we talked about the floodplain as a natural feature, and it's where excess water that the channel can't hold goes. And so when we have a floodplain map, that's what we're mapping. We're mapping the floodplains. They don't show localized flood risk, which is to say flood risks from sources other than floodplains. And this is where development really does have a big impact. If your neighbor, redevelops their property and they change the drainage pattern, and now when it rains, all the water from their roof, hits the side yard and flows straight towards your house, that's localized flooding. And that's not something that's going to be shown on the floodplain maps. Or if you live, in West Austin, and it's a real hilly area, and the streets, your house is maybe several feet below the street level, and that driveway goes down from the street straight down to your house. If we get enough rain that the water in the gutter overtops that crest of your driveway and it goes down your driveway straight into the house, that's what we refer to as localized flooding. And there's certainly plenty of that in the city, and it's not on the floodplain map. So when we get to the homeowners considerations, we can kind of talk about some ways you and your clients can evaluate that risk as well. I think a simple way to explain it is to say that floodplain maps show water coming from the creek. They don't show water going to the creek. And so when we have 4 inches of rain in an hour, there's going to be a lot of water trying to go to the creek at once. And that's not what we're mapping on floodplain maps. Also keep in mind, as we do have flooding occurring in the creeks, as the creeks get full, storm drain systems that try and drain to the creek are not necessarily going to function at their full capacity. If that outlet is trying to dump into the creek, but the creek's already full of water, that's just going to back up in the storm sewer system. And that's when you start having things like the water jumping the curb and going down driveways and stuff. So that's kind of an overview of flood risk. I don't really want to, with the screen sharing and the PowerPoint going, I can't see the chat right now, so I'll just ask Allison, does anybody have questions so far on just kind of understanding what floodplains are?
Nothing about that. Just one agent asked about, just wanted to confirm that they can ask questions later about specific properties. And I had told her, yes, we can do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what home buyers need to be thinking about when they look at properties in Austin. I think there's kind of 3 categories of questions that people need to ask themselves. And so first, they need to consider, what is the flood risk to this property? Is it in a floodplain? If it is in a floodplain, what do I know about the risk to the structure? And then also, look for indications that there may be potential localized flood issues as well. After that, you need to consider flood insurance. Is it something that would be appropriate to have? Is it going to be required? If you do want to have flood insurance, or you are going to have to get flood insurance, what is that going to cost? And make sure that you're prepared for that expense. as you think about, all of the expenses of buying a home. And then lastly, you need to think about development regulations and what that means for the future of the property. What are your intentions for the property? Is that compatible with the floodplain regulations? So with that, we can talk a little bit about flood risk. This is maybe a overly dramatic photo, but it is a photo from Austin. All of these photos are from Austin. But when you think about flood risk, the first thing you think about is the risk, obviously, to your life and your family's lives. Fortunately, in Austin, through engineering projects or buyout programs, we've really kind of minimized a lot of the risk, this really dramatic risk to lives. There's certainly still places where that risk may exist, and flooding can be very dangerous very quickly. But most of the buildings in the floodplains, we're not necessarily talking about a risk to life. But risk to property is certainly real and needs to be considered. Even minor flooding can get really expensive. I think people underestimate how expensive flooding can be, even if it's something that's not really presenting a threat to life. If you think about it, if you get a foot of water in your house, once you start getting a foot of water in your house, that's going to be, flooring, baseboards, sheetrock. It's going to get into the electrical systems. It's going to, cabinets, doors. You start thinking about all that expense, and it adds up really quickly and can get very expensive. So that's, where you need to understand flood risk and think about, the insurance and just, be prepared and understand what those expenses could be. Elevation certificates are the best way to evaluate flood risk. An elevation certificate is a FEMA document that's filled out by a surveyor and signed and sealed by a registered surveyor. And it's going to show key elevations of the house. It's going to show you the elevation of the ground around the house. It's going to show you the elevation of the finished floor, elevation of the garage, elevation of machinery servicing the building, like your AC condenser. And then with all of that survey information on the property, you can compare that to the floodplain elevations that we maintain and you can get from us online, and I'll show you how to do that. But you compare those elevations and you can start to understand, during a 100-year flood event, is water going to be in contact with the structure? If it is it going to come inside the house? How deep is it going to be? And that's how you can really get a sense for what the flood risk to the structure truly is. And then also, if you are looking at a house in the floodplain, if you think about, if you're comfortable with that risk, you need to still make sure that you have a plan, a safety plan. We've got information on that as well, but know where to get your weather alert information. Typically we don't encourage people to try and leave their homes during flooding. We recommend sheltering in place. It's almost always safer. But still get a good understanding of what the flood risk in that part of town is too. Even if you don't live in the floodplain, learn where the low water crossings are. If you're at work or you're picking up the kids from school and flooding's happening, do you know the safe route back home that's not going to involve you needing to drive through a low water crossing? That's, a lot of people haven't lived in Austin very long, and they may only know one route between work and home, and if that's flooded, what do they do? So it's important to understand where that flood risk is, in and around the home, and have some plans for what to do about it. Then the next step is to think about flood insurance. And the thing I'll say first of all is talk to an insurance agent about it, especially as soon as possible. Talk about it during the option period. Try and get a quote, understand what that cost would be. I'm certainly happy to answer questions about insurance. I know a lot about it, but an actual insurance agent's going to be your best source for information. Consider getting coverage whether or not it's required. Flood insurance protects against all kinds of flooding. It doesn't just protect against floodplains. It will cover local flooding as well. So there's plenty of people in this city that may not live anywhere near a floodplain, but may have some other conditions where flood insurance is a smart buy for them. And really, if you're not in the floodplain, it is very affordable. And then also, you know, talk to your clients, make sure they're getting contents coverage too. One of the things I've dealt with in flood recovery a lot is homeowners that had flood insurance because their lender required it, but the lender's really just requiring coverage for the building. You know, they're protecting their asset. And so I've dealt with lots of homeowners. We've had a flood and maybe their car is destroyed and they only had liability coverage on that, so they're not getting insurance money for their car. They've lost all their contents, so they're not getting insurance money for their contents, their clothes, things like that. And so the only insurance money they're getting is to make repairs to the structure. But they're now trying to figure out how to split that multiple ways to make themselves whole again. So it's, you know, think about all the things that you'd have to have insured from flooding, and make sure that when you're getting quotes for insurance, that's, you know, you're getting the appropriate coverage. You know, I'll talk a little bit here. Some of y'all have probably heard of Atlas 14. Maybe some of you haven't. Atlas 14 was kind of what we were calling some changes to the floodplain rules that are now in effect in Austin. They took effect last November. And that updated our floodplain maps in the city to reflect some new rainfall data that we had. The National Weather Service put out a report that updated rainfall statistics for our area. It added about the past 25 years of rainfall information to that period of record and then reran the numbers. So we're now basing our floodplains off a longer period of history. The update made floodplains in the city bigger. And the FEMA flood insurance maps do not yet reflect those changes. So when you look up our floodplains on our website, when you're dealing with floodplain regulations, you're dealing with these new larger floodplains. When your lender is checking to see if they're going to require flood insurance, they're still looking at the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. Those have not been updated yet. And it may, you know, it's going to take several years. We're in the process of working with FEMA to get that updated. But it's a long, you're going to have clients, they're going to be looking at homes. If you look on our website, we'll show it's in the floodplain and it'll be subject to our floodplain rules. And all of my recommendations about flood insurance, you know, are valid and true for that area, but their lender is going to do that flood zone determination as part of closing, and it's going to say they're not in the floodplain and flood insurance isn't required. Now, for that person, that's good. That means that, you know, that flood insurance that they should get and hopefully do go get is going to be cheaper because the FEMA maps don't show it in the floodplain yet. And getting that coverage now will probably keep it cheaper in the long run. But, you know, there are changes coming. FEMA's looking at making changes to how they calculate flood insurance rates. And then obviously we're updating the maps. And so, you know, flood insurance, I'm happy to talk about what the requirements are now. It's going to be changing a lot, you know, over the next couple of years. And so if your client's looking at something and it's in our floodplain, that will eventually be in the FEMA floodplain, and they will be required to get flood insurance even if they don't choose to at this time. And then I imagine y'all are going to have more questions about that, but I'll wait to see what y'all's questions are. And then lastly, you know, if they're comfortable with the flood risk and they're comfortable with the insurance and what it's going to cost and what they need, then they need to start thinking about development regulations. Think about, you know, what your plans are for the property and know what the rules are and understand if that's going to be compatible. You know, our floodplain rules I think they're as easy to understand as they can be, but they're still complicated, and we'll get into that in the next section. But I will also say another important point is when you're looking at a house in the floodplain, it's very important to check and make sure that all the improvements that are there have been properly permitted. You know, once you own a property, you're responsible for it, including any code violations. And I've had people purchase properties where maybe the previous owner converted the garage into a living room and they never got permits to do that. And then the new owner tries to pull a permit and they have to retroactively permit this garage conversion. Maybe it doesn't meet the floodplain rules. And I've had homeowners have to undo things like garage conversions that previous owners had done. So with that, before we really dive into floodplain regulations, are there any questions so far?
I haven't had any questions, but I just wanted to share with folks that I just decided to buy flood insurance, and I am not in the floodplain. And it was incredibly inexpensive. It was like $328 a year. And
yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And we're only covering my first floor contents. We didn't have to value our second floor contents because we figured that the likelihood of it ever getting up to the second floor. So that seems very worth it when, like what you described, the amount of damage that can happen.
I mean, you know, my condo now is on the second floor, and so I don't have flood insurance. It's on the second floor and on top of a hill. But you know, where I used to live, I remember in 2015 we had a storm. We had at my house I got about 6 inches of rain in 1 hour, and that ripped the gutter off the roof, and the gutter broke, and all that runoff from the roof went straight into the flower bed and filled up the flower bed. And I actually had water seep through the wall and had to, you know, recarpet the bedrooms, and it was, even that, you know, little bit of minor flooding was quite, you know, expensive and a big pain in the ass to deal with, especially considering we had more flooding in Austin that I was having to deal with during the day. But yeah, flood insurance, if you're not in the floodplain, flood insurance is real cheap. It's, you know, not everybody should have it, but there's probably a lot more folks should have it than do currently.
I live on the lake, and I thought I was in the 100-year floodplain, had flood insurance for several years, and all of a sudden I got a letter saying you're no longer in the 100-year floodplain. Excuse me, I didn't move. So the insurance went down a little. I don't. Is that a problem?
Well, I think, you know, we could. I think you can we can talk about and look at the property and see if maybe you should still keep flood insurance, and if.
Oh, I do keep flood insurance.
Yeah, so that's saving you money. So that's good. Let's talk a little bit about floodplains changing. You know, I think that's often a point of confusion for people. It's not so much that the floodplains change as it is that our understanding of them changes. We are constantly working on updating our maps, our floodplain maps in the city. And so every time we restudy something, there's going to be changes. And that could be because we have newer and more precise topographic data to draw the maps with. It could be because we have new rainfall information, like we had this last time, that changed the statistics. It could be that, you know, maybe we've had some erosion in the channel and it's changed how much the channel can hold. So there's a lot of reasons why floodplains change, and a lot of people assume it's just because of development. You know, they get a letter that says they're in the floodplain now and they hadn't been before. And so, oh, something must have changed. Somebody must have done something to put me in the floodplain. And really, it's just this continual effort to better understand and show that risk. And so it's, you know, there's some folks that are clearly in the floodplain and we're always going to think they're in the floodplain. And there's some folks that are clearly out. But if you're on the edge of that floodplain, you know, every time we update those studies, that line's going to move a little bit. And the reality is, whichever side you're on, whichever side of that line you're on, if you're close enough to it, think about the flood insurance. And if you're shown to be just outside of it, enjoy the fact that it's cheaper. But, also keep in mind, there's nothing that says we're going to have an exact 100-year flood. Nature does what it wants. We could have a little bit more, we could have a little bit less. This is just, floodplain maps are trying to capture a specific statistical event. It's, that is what that is. We have to draw a line in the sand somewhere for, where we think the risk is worth regulating and where it isn't. With that, let's talk a little bit more about floodplain regulations, development regulations. So all development within the city of Austin regulatory 100-year floodplain is regulated according to our floodplain rules. And so to do that, we review all permits within 100 feet of the floodplain. So if you're turning in a building permit application and your property is within 100 feet horizontally of where we've drawn the floodplain on our maps, it's going to get floodplain review, and we're going to look at it closer. I think one of the key things is to just explain the goal behind our regulations. If you understand what the goal is, I think sometimes the rules make more sense. Our goal is, we don't want any more families in the floodplain than we already have. Austin's got about, around like 8,000–9,000 structures in the floodplain today. We don't want to have any more people living in the floodplain than we have today. But we also want to have rules that allow the buildings that are in the floodplain to be redeveloped so that they can be made safer. We want to give homeowners options to make improvements to their property or to redevelop the property in a way that we're reducing the flood risk that structure may already have. So this is I got this broken down into a couple broad categories. So let's start with new buildings. You've got a property in the floodplain and you want to construct a new building on it. The city code prohibits all new buildings from the floodplain. Like, it starts with that blanket statement, no new buildings in the floodplain. And then it walks that back with a series of exceptions. So we start, that's kind of the tongue-in-cheek way to say it is, we start with no. And then we say, well, except in these cases. And so, one of those cases, and the one that your clients are going to be dealing with the most, is something we call the residential redevelopment exception. It allows you to replace an existing residential building, so, with a new building, so long as you're not increasing the number of dwelling units on site. So if you have a single family house, you could replace it with a new single family house. If you have a duplex, you could replace it with a duplex, or you could replace it with a single family house and an accessory dwelling. But you can't be increasing the number of dwellings on the property. That goes back to, we don't want more families in the floodplain than we have today. There's also an exception that allows for new buildings to be built in the Colorado River floodplain. When I talked about flash flooding and what made flooding in Austin's creeks so dramatic and quick, that's the reason why we don't want more buildings in the floodplain than we have today. There's an exception to that, though, which is the Colorado River, like Travis, Lake Austin, Town Lake, downstream of Town Lake. That is a little bit different situation. We do have more warning time, and you see that when we had the flooding on Lake Travis and Lake Austin a couple years ago, when we had the boil water notice. We had a couple days to warn the folks on Lake Travis, and they were able to evacuate those structures and even take their contents with them. And so there is an exception for new buildings to encroach in the Colorado River floodplain. And then all these new buildings in the floodplain, if there's an exception that's allowing you to build this new building, or if you go petition city council for a variance at a public hearing, which I'm not going to go too into that process. It's a very difficult process, but But if you are allowed to build a new building in the floodplain, there's some technical criteria for how you have to do it. It has to be properly elevated, at least 2 feet above the floodplain. And then you're going to have to hire an engineer, and that engineer is going to have to, certify and prove that the new building isn't obstructing water in a way that makes flooding worse for anybody else. He's going to have to prove that it's not displacing any more water than the previous development. We don't want to just fill in the floodplains because that's going to push water somewhere else. And then you also have to prove that it's structurally designed to withstand the forces of that floodwater. And so, building, we have these exceptions that allow you to build in the floodplain, but there is more engineering and potentially more cost and time involved in it. So it's important to know that going in, and it's important to have those professionals that have that engineer working with your architect from the start, so that you're not having to go back and reevaluate things. I think I messed up. Yeah, ignore that last slide. That wasn't supposed to be. So, new buildings, let's talk about additions. Additions must be elevated above the floodplain, same as a new building. And you also have to prove that that addition isn't making flooding worse for anybody else. You have to prove it's not causing an adverse impact. So all those engineering requirements for new buildings apply to additions as well. On top of that, when we're talking about additions to existing structures, we have to make sure it's not a substantial improvement. And so I'm going to talk about this some on this slide, and we'll talk about it on the next slide too. But substantial improvement is, it's a limit on how much money you can invest on a structure in the floodplain if that structure doesn't meet current rules. The reason this exists, and it's a required regulation from the federal government, the reason it exists is that flood insurance and federal disaster assistance are all paid out with taxpayer money. So in a sense, the public has a financial stake in the flood risk to any building. If you own that building, and so this is a way of saying there's a limit to how much we'll let you make improvements to a building before you have to do something to address that risk to the structure. So if the building doesn't meet current code, like if it's not at least 2 feet above the floodplain, and you want to do an addition, you can, but the addition must be properly elevated, and that addition cannot be a substantial improvement, which is exceeding 50% of the value of the structure. And the word structure is important. It's not property, it's structure. We have some very expensive properties in this city, but if you own a $1 million property on Shoal Creek, most of that value is in the land. The structure may only be worth $100,000 or $200,000, and that's what we're using to set that threshold. And it's cumulative over 10 years as well. So with that, let's talk about renovations and repairs, because this is where substantial improvement is real important. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't know about. Like, people can understand that there's rules about additions or new buildings, but this substantial improvement requirement on renovations and repairs is something that I think people don't understand as well as they should. So this is where we would get something like that elevation certificate we talked about earlier. We get that elevation certificate and we look and we see, does the house meet current code? Does it meet today's floodplain rules? If it does, then great. There's no limit on what you can do so long as what you're doing also meets the rules. But if it doesn't meet current code, if it's not properly elevated, which is the main thing, then we have this substantial improvement cap. And it's no more than 50% of the value of the structure cumulatively over a 10-year period for all improvements or repairs. So say a house is worth $100,000 and you do a $10,000 kitchen remodel. That's a 10% improvement. We'd issue the permit, you can do it, and you've done 10%. Now, you come back in 5 years and you want to do another remodel somewhere in the house. So we say, okay, well, that was 10%. It's not been more than 10 years, so that's still cumulative to this. Whatever you're doing now has to be less than 40% of whatever the value is at that time. You know, presumably the value is a little bit more because you did that remodel, but the percentage you have to work with is decreased because you've already done 10%. And so that's why we review building permits for things like interior remodels or repairs. And it's important for homeowners to understand what that limitation is, and it applies to improvements and repairs. So say you do, like, say you get the house and do this big remodel and it's 45%, we can approve that. It's 45%, but you've got like 5% left. Say something happens, there's a small fire, or like a drunk guy crashes into the side of the house, or there's a flood, and suddenly, you know, you've got damage that's beyond 5% that needs to be fixed. The code says we can't issue a permit for those repairs unless you bring the entire house into compliance with the floodplain rules. So it's something, this is a more nuanced conversation, but you know, if you've got people looking at homes that don't meet current code, and maybe they don't want to do anything to the house, maybe they don't have any plans for like additions, or they don't want to build a garage apartment, you know, those, you know, they're fine that maybe that stuff's not allowed, but they've got plans to do renovations and repairs. They still need to understand what the limits are and kind of how to be mindful of not potentially putting yourself in a bad situation. Real quickly, I'll talk about some kind of other development stuff. Swimming pools come up a lot, fences, gazebos, you know, structures like that aren't, it's not a building, it's not, you know, is it allowed in the floodplain, yes or no? The answer is, you know, if it's not a building, then yes, it can be in the floodplain. We're going to look at it from the same technical criteria, though. We want to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to make flooding worse for anybody else. You know, it doesn't have those elevation requirements and stuff because it's not a building, but we're not going to let you put a fence in the floodplain that's going to create like a dam and make flooding worse for the person upstream of you. Or we don't want the gazebo to break apart and become debris and get washed downstream and clog up some culvert, because that'll make flooding worse, you know. So there's still some, they're allowed, but there's still maybe some technical considerations and maybe some engineering costs that go with it. Here's a slide real quick explaining just kind of the elevation a little bit. If we talk about this house, we can see, you know, here's the lowest adjacent grade to the house. It's below the floodplain elevation, so that means the house is considered in the floodplain. This house is in the floodplain. But the finished floor, you know, look, it's 2 feet above the floodplain. This would be a house that meets current code. This wouldn't have the 50% cap on it because it meets current code. It's not fully in the floodplain. We wouldn't expect water in the house, but it's encroaching in the floodplain. Any additions, you know, we definitely look at. Flood insurance would be required by a lender, but it would be cheap because it meets freeboard. Freeboard is just another term for that difference between the finished floor and the floodplain. And it's really, you know, this is important when you're looking at homes in the floodplain. Is water going to come in the house? If so, how much? If it's not going to come in the house, how much margin of error do you have? This difference between finished floor and floodplain elevation is what sets the insurance rate for buildings that are in the floodplain. And it's a pretty standard regulation. And then kind of lastly, before we just get into general Q&A, wanted to show y'all one of our websites. This is Flood Pro. And it lets you look at floodplain maps for the whole city. You can get floodplain elevations to compare to your elevation certificate. You can look up maps. This animation's a little outdated. The website looks a little bit different, but we can look up some properties together and y'all will see what it looks like now. But you basically click the I want to button, and then you would click the find floodplain information. You can type in your address and click search, and then it'll pull it up and you can see the floodplain map. And so this is we're constantly making improvements. It's a little clunky to use on your cell phone, but it works on mobile. Works on Apple and PC, all that, and it'll show you the city floodplains. Those ones we talked about that are larger than the FEMA floodplains for the time being. And then we've got a general website, atxfloodsafety.com. That page has lots of links to lots of different sites. You can get to FloodPro through it. You can get to our website that has all the low water crossings in town and whether they're open or closed in real times. You can get to links to sign up for emergency weather alerts or, things about instructions about making emergency plans for your household. It's kind of just a good all-purpose clearinghouse for flood resources. Likewise, we have a email address, floodpro@austintexas.gov. That's kind of a general purpose hotline type email, and there's a hotline phone number too. We've got the Flood Pro site, like we're going to look at some more. And then I'm also fine if Allison wants to share my contact info. I've got, the emails we've traded have had my contact info in the bottom, so I'm fine if you want to share that as well.
Great. Put that in the chat.
So with that, yeah.
Somebody was asking about the Onion Creek buyouts and what the intention is of that land. My understanding is that it's going to remain undeveloped, correct?
Yeah. So, and that is the intention, to buy it out and turn it back into green space that it'll be parkland. It'll allow for some natural floodplain function. We can get some of the good water quality benefits of having that land. And then, yeah, we're Onion Creek is a situation where we really don't think there should be houses there. We have the redevelopment exception in the code, and that's great for maybe like Brentwood, the floodplain's a foot deep. That's probably okay that there's a house there. We just want to make sure that it's properly elevated. You get down to Onion Creek, we're talking about situations where the water is, 6, 7, 8 feet deep and moving so fast and with so much force that it's really, even if you put the house up high, it's really a dangerous situation. We had structures that were damaged because an F-150 washed through the first floor of the house, hit one wall, went through the living room and came out the other side. And, luckily the house didn't collapse on the spot, but the family was upstairs, sheltering from the flood, and that house was not structurally sound afterwards. So Onion Creek's a situation where buying out is the best option.
How many properties are being impacted by the change in the maps?
Well, so we just did a mail out, and we did the mail out to every property that is either in the floodplain or within 100 feet of the floodplain. And so this is going to include ones that still are not, but they're closer than they were. And it's going to include properties that were already in the floodplain. And we also made sure to send it to both tenants and owners if it's a rental property. And so all of that put together was 80,000 postcards.
Oh my God.
That's a lot. That said, when we look at structures, existing structures that got put into the floodplain by that change, it's about somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 structures were added to the floodplain as a result of that. So depending on how you want to think about the word impacted, it's a relatively small amount for the size of the city or quite a lot of people.
Great. And are you going to be able to, can you show us how to access the elevation certificates? And maybe somebody has a property that they'd like to have looked up.
Yeah, so here is FloodPro, and it does have some elevation certificates on here if you have one on file, but an elevation certificate more than likely is going to be something that the homeowner is going to need to hire a surveyor to complete. But FloodPro lets you see the maps and it lets you get floodplain elevations. So we can put in an address here. I put in my office building, and we can see it's pulled it up, and we can see there's floodplain in the street around here. Does anybody have an address that they?
Yeah, I just asked if Jackie, I thought you might have a property.
Yeah, I'm interested in those properties that back up to Dry Creek that are between Joe Sayers and Jim Hogg. I mean, I know they're in the floodplain.
Okay.
At one point, I thought the city was planning to offer some type of financial help to those homeowners to bring those properties that have been there up to current code. Is that something that is being discussed, or is there a plan in place for that?
It's something that has been discussed. It's kind of complicated. So FEMA does provide financial assistance for elevation of structures. The challenge for that is that to use federal money, it needs to meet a cost benefit ratio. And because of the value of properties in Austin, very few properties are going to meet that cost benefit ratio, unfortunately. And so then we've had discussions about, using city funds to do it. And talking with the city law department, we found that they have concerns about the city using drainage utility fee money for home elevation projects. If we use it for a buyout, that's one thing, because we're using we're using taxpayer money to purchase the property. We're reducing flood risk, but we're also acquiring something. The concern with using taxpayer money for elevation projects is we're not like acquiring something with the public's money. I don't personally agree with that. I think, I think by spending that money to reduce that flood risk, we are reducing the future burden on taxpayers for, flood response and recovery costs. So, but it's a complicated issue that we're still looking into. The short answer is, at this time, no, there's not financial assistance available for that. But it's something we're continuing to explore. So I've pulled up, sort of panned over to this area. Let's look at, let's look up an address. Let's look up 5613 Sayers. One thing I will advise on FloodPro is you really kind of, if you start typing, it'll auto-complete the address. You really have to do it this way. If I just type the full thing in and click search, it would give me a weird error. You kind of have to let it load the address and then choose it. And so we've pulled up this property here, and we can see some elevations. And so we can see the city of Austin 100-year floodplain elevation is 657.35. So that's the elevation of water during a 100-year flood at this property. Now this property is vacant, and so as a result of that, code would not allow you to build a house here. If somebody were to buy this, they wouldn't have any entitlement under the code to construct a new house here. Now this house next door, 1411 Thecla, if they wanted, say they wanted to tear down that house and build a new one, they would just need to make sure and properly elevate it. And let's see, pull up its elevation, and it's going to be real similar, 657.32. And so they would need to build the finished floor to 659.32, which is going to be about 3 feet above grade, it looks like. You know, it looks like this property is about a foot deep in the floodplain, and you need to be 2 feet above the floodplain, so you'd be about 3 feet above grade. And they'd have to prove that the new house wasn't displacing any more water and wasn't obstructing flow. But they would be allowed to do that.
Okay. Can we look at 5518, Joe Sayers?
Okay.
Just interested in knowing those. So I know that.
Yeah. So yeah, the 100-year floodplain elevation here is 655.41. And so that would put it, floodplain's probably about 3 to 4 feet deep on this lot. If we had an elevation certificate for this structure, we'd know the finished floor elevation. I'm gonna make a guess that the finished floor elevation for this house is like 654, would be my guess. And so then we could compare that to the 100-year, and we could see 655.41. Okay, so we'd expect about 1.5 feet of water inside this home during 100-year floodplain. It obviously meets current code, so if you were doing like an interior remodel, you'd be subject to that substantial improvement, 50% back. If you wanted to do an addition, that addition would have to be properly elevated to 657.4. So we'd be talking about an addition that was maybe, maybe the addition needs to be like 3-4 feet higher than the finished floor of the existing house. Maybe there's a design where that works. Maybe there isn't, you know?
Okay.
Can we pull up a different property?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can we pull up 1606 Rockcliffe Road?
Which property?
1606 Rockcliffe Road. Rockcliffe is all one word.
Is that within the city of Austin?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, but it was kind of garbled. What street number?
1606
Street?
Rockcliffe Road.
Okay.
There it is, yeah.
So we can see this is
The resident.
on the lake.
Yes.
And so we can see the floodplain back here. There's a little bit of floodplain on the property, but it's not really coming up much onto the property. So the house itself is outside the floodplain. You know, this would get assigned, if you're applying for a building permit, this would get assigned floodplain review. But if you're just doing something to this house, it's outside the floodplain. Wouldn't be any issues with us approving building permits. If you were wanting to build something back here, we'd ask for survey data to confirm where the floodplain boundary is.
Okay.
These floodplain maps are drawn to aerial topography. And so while they're pretty accurate, there's still a kind of level of precision there. If you start getting close to the boundaries, we start asking for on-the-ground survey. But this is a property that I would say, is not at risk from the floodplain. You may want to, maybe there's a local drainage risk, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Can you show us an elevation certificate so people can see how to read one?
Yeah.
You need a property that has one?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. You know what? Let's just let's pull up the blank form, and we can take a look at the form.
And I'll just share with everyone. You may have noticed that when you go into the MLS, when you first open it, and there's all of the resources. You can go to My Flood Status, and it will create a flood report for a property. So that's something you can look up for your clients who are buying, but you can also do it for when you have a listing and provide that as information to buyers.
Now, when you look that up on MLS, is it looking at the city floodplain maps or just the FEMA maps?
Just looking at FEMA for now.
Because that's something to, yeah, so that's something, remember, we've adopted these new floodplains,
Yep.
and the FEMA maps aren't updated yet. So that's something to be real cognizant of. That MLS report may say it's not in the floodplain, and the lender's not going to require flood insurance, but if it's in the city floodplain and they want to do construction, it may well have, restrictions.
That's a good point.
This is taking longer to load than I thought it would. I think we're taxing my free Google Fiber pretty hard. Come on. Let's just try it in the form of There we go. It's starting to load up. All right, so an elevation certificate is going to have a lot of pages to it. There's going to be a lot of information on here. You don't really need that much of it to get a good understanding of flood risk. A lot of this is for the insurance agents when they're writing policies. But this section C is going to tell us really a lot of what we need to know. So down here, C2 is elevations. And we can look at F, it says lowest adjacent grade next to the building. That's going to be the lowest elevation of the ground around the building. So in this diagram here, this point down here where the foundation meets the ground, this would be the lowest adjacent grade. And if that lowest adjacent grade is lower than the floodplain elevation that you're getting from FloodPro, that's going to tell us that the building's in the floodplain. We would expect water to come in contact with the structure in some way. Then, if we go look at C2A, top of bottom floor, this is usually, but not always, the finished floor elevation of the house. And so we would go here and look, and we would see this elevation of the finished floor is going to be C2A. And that's going to, we can compare that to the floodplain, and that's how we can look to see, would we expect water to come into the house? Is it 2 feet above the floodplain? Does it meet current code or not? And so really, there's a lot of good information on here. The two most important ones are going to be this lowest adjacent grade and the top of bottom floor. And so that's going to be the two things that we're really looking at to understand what the risk to the structure is. Is it in the floodplain, and does it meet current code or not? And if y'all got an elevation certificate, we're more than happy to, walk people through it and answer, questions they may have and stuff.
Do you know about what it costs to get an elevation certificate?
It kind of varies. I think it can run anywhere between like $300 and $900. I'd recommend calling around to places. Sometimes, it depends on the size of the lot, size of the house, vegetation, how much work is it going to be for the surveyor to survey everything they need to. But they're a couple $100. It's a useful tool to have. Both for building permits, but also Also for things like flood insurance and understanding the flood risk, it's not a bad investment. Somebody wanted to look up.
Yeah, going back to the maps, can you find them going through those maps?
Yes, there will be, if we have one on file, there's going to be a little kind of green dot on the property.
Okay.
Let's see. So this little green circle with an X is a sign that we have an elevation certificate. And we have a, you can do I want to and find elevation certificates. And you can search an address, and if we have an elevation certificate, it'll pull it up by address. And so that's an option too. We've got, sometimes that elevation certificate may be really old. If it's really old, maybe sometimes they don't have all the information we need. So, certainly a good idea to check Flood Pro at first, but there's not a guarantee we'll have one, and there's not, and even if we do, sometimes we may need a newer one. This address that someone wanted me to look up here on Colony Park, it's well outside the floodplain. We can see we got some floodplain down here, but we're really far away from it. We go over, this is one of the Onion Creek buyout areas. Or no, this isn't. This is Crystal Brook. This is not a buyout area, but you can see we've got elevation certificates here for a lot of these structures, and a lot of this neighborhood is in the floodplain. But over here in Colony Park, it's clear.
Yeah, somebody else has another question. I was just wondering, how far does the city's jurisdiction or authority extend? I often get questions from agents asking about the ETJ.
So we are the floodplain administrators for the city's zoning jurisdiction. So full purpose and limited purpose. If it's ETJ, it would go through Travis County, except for certain types of site plans and subdivisions. We have agreements where there's joint review and we both look at it. But for just like a residential property, if it's in the ETJ, it would be whatever county it is, Travis County, maybe Williamson, maybe Hayes. You're going to be dealing with me if we're talking about full purpose and then limited purpose, which a lot of the stuff around the lake is limited purpose, and that can be a little complicated. Limited purpose, you really are dealing with the city and the county for stuff.
Okay. We have one more property, 1703 Victoria Drive.
So yeah, we can see this here. We've got some floodplain in the backyard. It looks like the structure, portion of the structure is in the floodplain. I think this house is probably going to look a lot like this diagram. We'd get the elevation certificate and we'd see the lowest adjacent grade, is going to be in the backyard. This point is probably going to be, somewhere here or something. And it looks like it's going to be below the floodplain elevation. So the house is in the floodplain. And then we need to know what the finished floor is. The finished floor is probably above the floodplain, but it may not be a full 2 feet above. And so that's what we would need to know whether or not the house is conforming or non-conforming as far as regulations go. But it looks like the street is out of the floodplain. So I think from a risk perspective, we're probably talking about a situation where I don't think we would expect to see water enter the home. You would have access in and out of the property during a flood event, but we would expect floodwater to come in contact with the structure. And then we'd need to see that elevation certificate to know, would water really come in the home? If so, how much? If not, is it high enough to meet code? So there may be some restrictions on development on this, but the flood risk for something like this is going to be very different than, say, the homes we're buying out in Onion Creek.
Great. Well, we've gone over a little bit. So unless somebody has any more questions, I just want to thank you so much, Jameson. This was really, really useful, and I really appreciate it. And I especially appreciate how you seem to understand how it applies to our field so much.
Yeah, no problem. I'm always happy to do things like this. It's like I said, having these conversations makes my job easier because I'm the one that's in charge of the residential side. I've got a coworker that's in charge of the commercial side of this, and then I'm the one in charge of the residential side of this. And so I have, you know, lots of tough conversations with homeowners that have bought properties assuming they can add a garage apartment or something when they can't. So if we can avoid those situations before they close on the property, it makes my life easier and y'all's life easier, because then you don't have a client set that you help them buy something that isn't.
Exactly. Yes.
Somebody asked if me directly. Yeah, you're free to contact me directly. If it's kind of a more basic question, I would say to email that FloodPro email address that was in the presentation, floodpro@austintexas.gov. That's something that several people check and monitor. So, you know, that may get you a faster response, but you're free to contact me, especially if you've got some super complicated specific question. I don't mind at all.
Okay, and I put your email and phone number in the chat, so they've got that. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. Y'all have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.